Good afternoon. Welcome to the noon meeting of the Rotary Club of Baton Rouge. This is our continued hybrid meeting format. Our speaker, Paula Davis, will be speaking to us about adoption here in a minute, but we'll start off with the invocation by Tammy Abshire.
Please bow your head. Gracious and loving God, we pause to give you thanks and praise for the abundant blessings you have bestowed upon us. For life and safety, life and health, safety and comfort, food and nourishment, we are sincerely grateful. Open our hearts that we may be ever better stewards of these rich and unmerited gifts. Show us how to be a blessing for the poor, sick, lonely, and all who suffer. As Rotarians, we are thankful for warm hearts that echo with the call to serve. We're thankful for strong hands that do the work to serve. We're thankful for wise minds that consider how best to serve. And we are thankful that Rotary brings us together with opportunities to improve our community and our world. In our assembling today, may we be a witness of our faith to others and grateful for your many blessings. In your name we rejoice. Amen.
And Phil Brantley will lead us in the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And Lane Dodd with the four-way test.
Of the things we think, say, and do, is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill, better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
And now Jeff Zimmerman will introduce our guest.
Welcome. If you'd hold your applause until all our guests are standing, I'd like to introduce these following guests. Scott Wilfong, he's a visiting Rotarian from Rotary from Southeast Baton Rouge. Thanks, Scott. Tim Coleman, Aaron Monroe Wesley. Please continue standing, please, so we can welcome you properly. Campbell Owen, Loretta Ragland, Stephanie Sterling. Let's welcome.
Okay, today's head table from my right, your left. Phil Brantley, Associate Executive Director, Pennington Biomedical Research. Patty Fox, CEO of Co-Creations Consulting. Anthony Pope, Senior Vice President, Cox Communications. Lane Dodd, VP, Commercial Relationships Manager at Home Bank. I'm Haggai Davis, your club president. Paula C. Davis, our speaker, who will be more formally introduced in a minute. Maui Tachi, Financial Advisor, Dent Wealth Management Advisors. And Tammy Abshire, Vice President of Advancement, the LSU Alumni Association, your head table. Okay, we have a few announcements today. We are doing our quarterly blood drive. The van is just outside. If you don't have an appointment, if you didn't pre-schedule, that's okay. They will be glad to take you. I actually went before the meeting and without scheduling, so they'll be glad to take your blood. Do so if you can. Off-site fellowships will be on June 30th, so sign up. You should have gotten an email last Friday to pick the place where you want to go for your off-site meeting. Do that. That's always a real fun time. And then next Wednesday, May 26th, Our guest speaker is Adrian Slack, who will be speaking to us about the economic recovery and how's it going. We again welcome you to come here. If you're not available to come here, YouTube and Facebook Live will still be there. So with that, we'll start with the meeting. Mal, if you'll introduce our speaker.
You've noticed Haggai Davis has been on pretty good behavior today, and that's because our speaker, Paula C. Davis, is his wife, and so she's here to make sure that he doesn't get too far out of line in his last couple of weeks. So Paula C. Davis, LCSW, PACS, has more than 20 years of both domestic and international adoption experience working with birth parents, adoptive parents, and adopted people. Currently, Paula is an instructor at the LSU School of Social Work and a field education liaison. Paula also works part-time at Catholic Charities of the Diocese of Baton Rouge. Here she serves as the Hague Accreditation Coordinator and was instrumental in increasing protections and transparency for adoption in Louisiana. She also provides counseling and supports for families post-adoption. Paula has dedicated her career to serving families who adopt children with special needs, are older, and are more difficult to place. Paula has presented on adoption at local, state, and national conferences. And in 2019, Paula received the Angel in Adoption Award from the Congressional Coalition on the Adoption Institute. Our speaker, Paula C. Davis.
Okay, so Maui outed me. I am Haggai's wife. So how many of you, when you saw my name presenting today, thought, wait, Paula Davis, didn't she just come a couple of weeks ago? Yeah. So actually, I am the other Paula Davis. And as Maui mentioned, I am an international adoption social worker, and I work part-time at Catholic Charities. And I'm really excited to be here. Part of my role at Catholic Charities is our Hague accreditation. And that accreditation sets the standards for competent, ethical, transparent adoption practice. So what does that mean? It means that our staff have to have at least 30 hours of continuing education every 2 years. The families that are adopting internationally have to undergo training, and there's transparency as far as fees. So when a family is adopting from our agency, they know from the very beginning how much it's going to cost them to adopt. Not only the fees that they're paying to the agency, but fees that they're paying to other entities. So that accreditation for families that are adopting internationally sets a standard for competent, ethical, transparent adoption practice, but also has protections in place for all parties in adoption. So it's protections for adoptive parents, protections for adoptive people, and protections for birth parents. So as the Hague Accreditation Coordinator, I often wondered why the protections that we offer families that are adopting internationally are not afforded to people who are adopting here in this state. And so just a little bit of backstory and part of the reason why I'm so excited to be here today. In 2016, I came to a luncheon here at Rotary and got introduced to a group of Rotarians. And as happens when I'm involved in the conversation, the topic of adoption came up. And what started out as a conversation at a Rotary lunch 2 years later became a law that puts protections in place for families that are adopting domestically here in the state. So I am so excited to be here today to be giving back to you guys who have given so much to us, maybe unbeknownst to you. And as Maui said, I'm an instructor at the LSU School of Social Work, but I need to say that I'm not speaking on behalf of the School of Social Work. But what I'm talking about today is based on my experience and expertise. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't say that May is National Foster Care Awareness Month. So it's really appropriate that I'm here today. So thank you so much for having me. Okay, so before we go too much further, I'd like to know who's in the room. So with a show of hands, if you're comfortable, would you raise your hand if you've been touched by adoption? So maybe birth parent, adopted person, maybe extended family members. Okay, so we have some people in the room who've been touched by adoption. Great, okay. And here, let me use my clicker. It's going to take me a while to get this technology down. So we do have some folks in the room who've been touched by adoption. All right, it's not advancing. Okay. All right, thank you. So what we know is about approximately 60% of the population has been touched by adoption. And there's about 5,000 children in the state of Louisiana who are in foster care. About 600 of those children are waiting for their forever families. Okay, thanks. Can you go on to the next slide? Okay, this is our definition of adoption. How someone defines adoption influences how they view adoption. And when we talk to adoptive families, oftentimes when they are defining adoption, they're defining adoption from their perspective. So their definition of adoption is gain. Their definition of adoption is win. But for a birth parent, they may not be defining adoption as gain or win. They might be defining adoption as loss. So when we're defining adoption, we want to make sure that our definition of adoption is inclusive and is reflective of all parties in the process. So this is a definition that we came up with at Catholic Charities. And it's adoption is a lifelong intergenerational process that unites the constellation of birth families, adopted persons, and adoptive families forever. So the first thing that stands out in this definition is adoption is lifelong. Adoption is not a one-time transaction. Just like a wedding is not a marriage, adoption is not that legal event. But if you're defining adoption as a one-time transaction, then do you understand the normative challenges that adoptive families face that maybe families that aren't built through adoption don't have to face? The next thing that we talk about is how it's intergenerational. So not only are birth parents losing a child, but grandparents may be losing a grandchild. Great-grandparents may be losing a child. And if a family is adopting transracially, from this point forward, this family will be a transracial family. And it's getting families to look past the moment of placement to understand, are they equipped to parent the child until this child turns 18? And honestly, as a parent of adult children, I recognize that we don't stop parenting when our kids turn 18. The next thing is that everyone is united. So even if we don't know who our child's birth parents are, we are connected to them through our child. I can think of one adoptive dad who did not speak, One adoptive dad who did not, he was preparing to meet his child's birth family who did not speak English. And he said, I know we'll communicate in a heartbeat. And to me, that is just so beautiful because truly they were communicating in a heartbeat. They were communicating through their child's heartbeat. So whether we know who our child's birth parents or not, we are forever connected to them. Then we talk about the constellation because really it's more than just birth parents. And as we'll talk about a little bit further down the road, many of the women that we work with who are making adoption plans are already parenting other children. So it may be a child who is losing a sibling. And then lastly, we talk about adopted persons. So when I talk about adoption, I say adopted person, not adoptee, because a person is not solely defined by their status of adoption. And then we talk about adopted persons, not adopted children, because as a friend of mine would say, good Lord willing and the creek don't rise, we only spend a small portion of our lives as children, but the bulk of our lives are spent as adults. So if we are talking about adult adopted people and we call them adopted children, then does it make it easier to deny them rights that maybe might be afforded to people who aren't adopted? Okay. All right, so now the myths of adoption. All right, so I want y'all to take a look at the myths and raise your hand if you hold any of these myths in your head. So I will go ahead and raise my hand and admit that I had a lot of these myths when I began to work in adoption practice. So if you look at the myths, how many of you believe some of these myths? Well, obviously now you know that they're not true, but how many of you believe these myths before coming today? Okay, so a lot of people in the room hold some of these myths. Okay, so we'll talk about them. So one of the things to me that really stands out, there was an adoption policy think tank, and it was called the Donaldson Adoption Institute. In 2015, they had started a campaign to change the laws regarding adoption in the United States. So they were calling for a uniform, consistent adoption law across the country. That each state has its own rules and its own guidelines about adoption. And so as part of their campaign to adopt reform, they had a listening tour and went across the country. And as part of that listening tour, they had a simple foster care and adoption quiz. And what they found out was the average person scored a C- on that adoption and foster care quiz. So if people are operating from a place of misperception and bias, will we ever be able to have good adoption practice? Will we ever be able to reform adoption? So the first myth, it actually is a myth that I had when I began working in the field of adoption. I said, oh my gosh, what happy work. And it's true. There are happy times in adoption. When you think about that moment of placement for a family that is wanting to adopt and they finally are able to adopt, that really is exciting. But everybody who comes to adoption through loss. So it's important that those losses are recognized and that those losses are grieved. The next myth is the high school girl who got in trouble. I think that people have this myth. Now, the high school girl who got in trouble, she probably was making an adoption plan in the 60s and 70s. In fact, she was probably a girl who was sent away. Many of you might know that there was a maternity home in New Orleans called St. Vincent's. And when a young woman found herself pregnant, she was sent there. She was given a fake name. She might have been given a fictitious husband, and she was told to never think of this again. But today, the high school girl who's getting in trouble is still getting in trouble. She's just not choosing to make an adoption plan, in part because there's not the same stigma against single parenting, but also we have resources in place to help young women parent. The women that we work with that are making adoption plans are typically older, and they're already parenting other children. And if this is the only thing that you hear today, then I will consider this a win, but they are excellent parents. So in order to be a good parent, you have to put your child's needs above your own. And I cannot think of a more significant example of a mother putting her child's needs above her own than making an adoption plan. So if that is all you take away from today, then I will consider this a win and I will drop the mic and walk away. The next myth that we have is what kind of person could give their child away? And again, it takes a lot of courage and a lot of bravery. And the women that we work with are making this decision in the face of a lot of judgment. So it is important to recognize that this is a brave, loving, selfless decision. The next thing that we hear is what a lucky child. And one of the things that always concerns me about what a lucky child is people will go up to a child and say, oh, how lucky you are. Well, number one, a child may or may not feel lucky depending on the type of adoption that they've had. But for biological children, there's not this sense that they have to be grateful to their parents. So there's this sense for adopted children that they need to be grateful. And what does that look like for that child as they grow? But I will often say that I have a child who's 27 and one that is 21. The 27-year-old has just now begun to say, hey, mom and dad, maybe you didn't do such a bad job. I am still waiting to hear from our 21-year-old that maybe we didn't screw up too bad. But no child is expected to be grateful to their parents. But when you say what a lucky child, basically you're implying that they've been rescued and that they should be grateful to their parents. And that really is unfair to that child. The next myth is that adoption is rescuing children from bad places. And again, when you're operating from adoption being rescuing, then does it impact your practice? And do you think the ends justify the means? And we have to do everything that we can to get this child away from this mom. So it really is operating from a place of women are bad people who are considering adoption plans, when really that is not the case. The next myth is that it takes a lot of money to adopt. And honestly, there is some truth to this myth. I mentioned earlier the law that was passed in 2018. What that law did was it put caps on living expenses for women who were facing a crisis pregnancy and making an adoption plan. In the state of Louisiana, prior to this law taking effect, when a woman was pregnant, she could receive reasonable living expenses for the duration of her pregnancy. Unfortunately, in the law, there was no definition of what reasonable was. And so what was happening is women were receiving $30,000 and $40,000 of living expenses for the duration of their pregnancy. Those fees were being paid by adoptive couples. And if the mother decided to parent, then the adoptive couple was out that money. So it really was expensive in order to adopt. But with that law, we now have caps on living expenses. And I will say that this is the highest cap in the country, but it's $7,500 for actual documented living expenses. So it really does put protections in place for birth parents, but also for adopted people. And if it takes a lot of money to adopt, you need to ask why. And for families that are adopting from the Department of Children and Family Services, there is no cost. So when I talk about those 600 children who are in foster care who are waiting for their adoptive families, there is no cost to adopt those children. The next myth is the myth of closed adoption. So there was a time when adoptions were closed, but what I will tell you is that in this day and age with social media, there is no such thing as a closed adoption. So our job as adoption professionals is to prepare families for that inevitability, that the fact that one day this adoption will be open. The next myth is that we want to adopt a healthy newborn. And what I will say is that there is no such thing as a healthy newborn even in domestic adoption. And the reason we say that is because we know the impacts of stress prenatally now. And stress prenatally impacts a child's body and its brain and its biology as that child is developing. And it's important that families are aware of that. So there's that impact. And women who are making an adoption plan are not making that plan because things are going well, but they're making that plan because things are not going well. And the other thing is she's not taking care of her body as if she were getting pregnant. This is an unplanned pregnancy. So mom may be drinking alcohol. Mom may be taking prescription medication. There might be other drugs that she's taking. And it may take her a while before she realizes that she's pregnant. So all of those things impact that baby as it's developing. And it's important that families are adopting are aware of those realities and that they're prepared for those realities. Then the next myth is birth mothers were promised confidentiality. And this is a myth that really, really sort of riles me up. I mentioned earlier that I also work very part-time at Catholic Charities. And part of my role there is working with adult adopted people who are searching. And I have connected with many women who made adoption plans in the 60s and 70s, and they were not promised confidentiality. They were not even given a choice. They were told, this is so bad that you're being sent away and you are never to speak of again. And they were also told it is against the law for you to contact your child. So when an adult adopted person comes to me and says, why wasn't she searching for me? And I'll say, it's because she was told that it was against the law. Several years ago, there was a bill that was before the House that would allow access to information for adult adopted people. And one of the people who came out against the bill repeated this myth that birth mothers were promised confidentiality. And what I will tell you is women were not given a choice. And when they are given a choice, they overwhelmingly choose openness. And that's true whether it's an adoption that's happening today, and it's true whether I'm contacting them about a search. So when women are given a choice, they overwhelmingly choose openness. And then the last myth that we hear is that an adopted person's desire to search is reflective of a negative relationship with their adoptive family. So this is something that we hear a lot. And as the person who gets the phone call from the adopted person, the first thing they say to me is, I love my adoptive parents' butt, or my adoptive parents are my parents' butt. And really, we call that the adopted person's loyalty disclaimer. Really, what they're saying is, I want to know. I want to know, who am I? I want to know who I look like. I want to know where I come from, and I want to know why I was adopted. For people who were adopted in a closed adoption, the first time that they see someone that looks like them is when they have their own biological child. That's something that when you are parented in your family of origin that you take for granted. And so it is really important to recognize that people who are searching because they want to know where they come from. And usually my experience is they have really good relationships with their adoptive parents. And the other thing is that once they have access to their birth families and they have more information, it tends to improve the relationships in their lives. Okay. All right, so those are the myths. And I will tell you, these are not all the myths. I could spend an entire day just talking about adoption myths, and then I would also have to be told to simmer down because I tend to get on a roll and get very excited. All right, next slide. Thank you. So some differences in adoption. In Louisiana, there's two ways to adopt. There's agency adoptions and there's attorney adoptions. And the process varies tremendously whether you're adopting through an attorney or through an agency. When you're adopting through an adoption agency, I will tell you, as an adoptive couple, there's about 80 pages of regulations that you have to meet in order to adopt. When you're adopting through an attorney, there's about 8 paragraphs of regulations that you have to meet in order to adopt. So if you were an adoptive family and you reached out to an agency and you said, we want to adopt, and I said, this is the list of the things that you have to do. And then you call an attorney and the attorney says, this is the list of the things that you have to do. Who would you choose? So when an attorney is operating an adoption, typically adoption is seen as a one-time transaction rather than a lifelong journey. And attorneys are not operating from a child welfare perspective. So there's less support for birth and adoptive families pre and post placement. But also it's much more about finding a child for a family than a family for a child. Whereas when you're working with a licensed adoption agency, it really is about finding a family for a child rather than a child for the family. So the child's needs are the ones that take precedence. So I think that that is the biggest difference. But again, the laws in this state are influenced by the biases and misperceptions that we have about adoption. And if we think that adoption is a one-time transaction, then we think that that's okay. And I would argue that that's not okay. And we know what the research says. And the research says that adoptive families also need more support. One of the things that I'm really excited about in my role at LSU is I will help bring more adoption content into the child welfare curriculum. And we've already started that process by bringing adoption competent training to our new social workers as they're beginning their education. But also next week, we're starting with a collaboration with DCFS to bring adoption competent mental health professional training here to this community, because adoptive families need support on that journey for the normative things that they experience that maybe a biological family doesn't experience. And it helps to do that in a way that is non-stigmatizing and doesn't see it in a negative light, but recognizes that it is part of how the family was built. Okay, next slide. Okay, so access to adoption records. So this is information about the United States and how there are some states that do allow adult adopted people access to their adopted records. So any state that is green is an unrestricted state. So what that means is an adult adopted person has access to their original birth certificate. There are some states that are gold, and those are compromised states. So sometimes it means there's an intermediary that operates, or sometimes it means that there is a mechanism for birth parents to opt out of the system that allows an adult adopted person access to their records. One of the things to me that's really interesting is that even in states where there is an opt-out mechanism, it is rare that birth parents opt out. So again, when women are given a choice, they overwhelmingly choose openness. Louisiana is a closed record state. What does that mean? So what that means is that your original birth certificate is locked away. You do not have access to it. So as the person who helps people with search and reunion, when they call me, if that other party is not open to connection, I cannot provide any identifying information. That's a really difficult phone call to have. An even more difficult phone call to have is your birth mother is deceased and she was looking for you too. There are some days that there's not enough money in the world for me to do this job, but your birth mother is deceased and she was looking for you too. And it's these laws that get in the way of people having access to information. As part of that listening tour, there was a study that was done, and about 70% of people believe that adult adopted people should have access to information. And I believe that that is true. Now, I would not say that we should disempower women who made adoption plans. I think we need to respect their wishes, but we need to at least give people a choice. Okay, so the next slide. All right, so then lastly, impact of DNA on search. So the thing that you need to be aware of is regardless of whether we wanted to or not, the face of search is changing. People have access to birth parents through DNA registries now. Richard Hill, who is a pioneer in this field, said that 92% of people who register with a site like Ancestry or 23andMe match with at least a first cousin immediately upon registering and being tested. So whether we acknowledge it or not, whether we're involved or not, people are finding their birth parents. But doesn't it make sense to do this in a way that is prepared and thoughtful and respectful of all parties involved? What are some of the challenges with the impact of DNA on search? So earlier I mentioned that women who made adoption plans in the 60s and 70s were told to never speak of this again. Many of them never did. So they might be married and their husband may not know. The children that they're parenting may not know. But can you imagine a first cousin getting a match on a DNA registry and outing a woman who's a birth parent? Again, she's not having any control over that decision. Or in Louisiana, prior to the 1990s, men who fathered a child that was placed for adoption did not need to be notified that a child that they fathered was being placed for adoption. So can you imagine a man getting a phone call from an adult child that he did not know was born and placed for adoption? And again, wouldn't it make sense for the person who is involved in that to be prepared, to move thoughtfully, to have someone who can help prepare them for what search might look like, to help them negotiate and navigate that relationship? So anyway, what we're seeing now is that DNA really is changing the face of search, and we need to be prepared for that. Okay, the last slide. All right, so what's next? So you're probably listening to this and you're thinking, okay, so what? So what? So why does this matter? Well, I mean, I think it matters to the people in this room who raised their hands, who've been touched by adoption. I think it matters to the people in this room who were touched by adoption who didn't raise their hands, maybe somebody who is a birth parent. It matters to that young couple who is facing a crisis pregnancy and is thinking about making an adoption plan. Can you imagine if they received support for that brave, loving decision that they made rather than judgment or disdain? It matters to that child that when they join a family, people don't come up to them and tell them how lucky they are. And so now what I ask of you is that when you hear misinformation or myths about adoption, I encourage you to combat that with accurate, reflective adoption language and the truth about adoption to help improve adoption in the state for families that are living that journey. Thank you. All right. So, do I have time? Okay. All right. So I have time for questions. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, okay. We have a couple questions. Okay, good.
Two comments. The first one, there's a motion on the floor that I got be removed.
Oh.
Second.
But the other one is, we hear so many times about the number of parents who are looking to adopt, and yet you say there's 600 in the state waiting to be adopted. It seems like a disconnect there.
There is a disconnect. And I think part of it is that families are not aware of the children in DCFS's custody who are waiting for a forever family. So but one of the other challenges with DCFS is that you have to foster in order to adopt. And so for some families, they're not able to do that. They're not able to take it into their home with the understanding that their child may be returned to their biological family. Does that answer the question? And when you mentioned that there's a bill on the floor, I did want to mention there is a bill on the House floor that will require attorney adoptions to meet the same standards for post-placement supervision as agency adoptions. And again, it is a step in the right direction. So I thought that's what you were going to say. Any other? Okay. Okay.
I had a friend of mine, they adopted a little boy from China. How does that work with the different adoptive agencies? Like you see a lot of that from foreign countries.
Okay.
Is that handled for you guys, or is that something different?
So Catholic Charities does work with families that are adopting internationally. And one of the things is that for international adoptions, those are usually closed adoptions. And for families that are adopting internationally, they're getting very little information about their child's history and background. And when I say very little, I mean, sometimes we don't even know how old the child is. And it's not that we might be off a couple of days. We may be off a couple of years because there's so little information. And again, part of that process is making sure that families are prepared and trained and supported for parenting that child to help them be the best parents possible. And I would say too, in China, typically at one point, it was only girls that were available for adoption. That is now changed, and both boys and girls are available for adoption. And in international adoption, it is considered a special need to be born a boy because most families want a little girl. So your wait may be longer if you were a little boy to be adopted internationally. Yes.
I appreciate that. Two questions.
Okay.
If I could. One's really easy to answer. Do you have to have prior experience as a foster parent to be an adopted parent?
No, you do not.
Okay.
That's easy. Okay.
The second question is, how, if you choose to adopt a child of foreign origin, like from China, since you're their parents, how does the child figure in as far as citizenship, as far as being a U.S. citizen?
Okay. All right, so that's a great question. For children that are adopted internationally, typically they are automatic U.S. citizens. So there's a three-way test, and so it's not a four-way test, it's a three-way test, but it's, are the parents U.S. citizens, is the adoption full and final, and has the child set foot on U.S. soil? If all three things are true, then that child receives automatic U.S. citizenship. That did not happen until the early 2000s. So I think it was 2001 when that act was passed. What was happening, though, is that there were adults who were adopted internationally before that act took effect, where their families never went through the final paperwork to get them to be U.S. citizens. And if they were convicted of a minor crime, so let's say maybe they had some marijuana on them, they could be deported. But that, for most people, has changed. But there is still a small loophole. We're working to change that now. I think Senator Klobuchar has a bill before the Senate to change that. But currently, if you are adopted by U.S. citizens, as long as your adoption is full and final and you set foot on U.S. soil, you are an automatic U.S. citizen. Oh, God. I'm a little nervous.
I'm the executive director of Catholic Charities, and Paula's very humble, but I want to brag about her. We are in the midst of taking accreditation right now to talk about adoptions. We are the only Louisiana agency in Louisiana that is licensed for international adoptions. And it is an excruciatingly detailed and painful process. Every 3 years, it's about a 3-month process. And Paula's in the midst of that right now. And it's Paula and her supervisor, Sterling, that are here, who provided the leadership for that. But the level of scrutiny that you have to go through to become Hague accredited, and then we apply that to all of our adoptions as well, is more rigorous than any other adoption agency in Louisiana.
Yeah.
Unless you're a celebrity, then you just go international, pick up a kid, and bring it back, right?
Well, I can't speak to that. I've not worked with any celebrities.
Questions with regard to children that are currently in detention centers. Their parents have been sent to these immigration centers. How would a child in that circumstance be adopted, or are they even eligible for adoption if they can't be reunited with the family?
I honestly do not know the answer to that question. And I think that that is a situation that will continue to evolve as children continue to be placed in detention centers. But ultimately, your first goal is always reunification with the biological family. And then if that's not possible, then, is there kin who can be connected or found? And then adoption really is seen as a last resort. But I think we will see some challenges in that with children who are in the detention facilities who are in need of families. All right. Any other questions? No? All right. Thank you.
And that was the real Paula Davis. Meeting adjourned.
Wait, are you saying something else?